All right, ladies and gentlemen, it finally happened. We do have Bob from Speaker's Corner here on the podcast. It is very exciting. Bob, thank you for making the time for coming on here today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's taken some time, and I'm glad you've been willing to let me try and talk a little bit about this topic. It's something I'm wanting to get my teeth into more and more these days.
Yeah, no, it's great. Today we're going to be talking about the reliability of the hadiths and precisely what they are in the Islamic worldview. But just briefly, I was trying to get a hold of you for a while. I actually went on the website and I tried to book an appointment, and it didn't seem to have any success for some reason. And I ended up making that, sort of reposting that famous video of you where, you know, you say that my Christianity is the Christianity
the one that's just
conquered
followed
the
me
Roman
around now.
Empire.
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
I was like, please, someone help me get in touch with Bob. I'd love to interview him. And then about the next morning, 12 hours later, I get a message on Twitter like, I heard you're looking for me. And I read it in your accent. You know, it just sounded like you. So, really, really grateful for this. So before we kick off and you explain about the hadiths and how they work, just firstly, how did you get so knowledgeable when it comes to Islam? You know, whenever I see you interview someone or debate someone from the other side, you rarely misrepresent their views at all. You know, they may accuse you of such, but you do a great job of trying to represent precisely what they believe, and your knowledge seems to be a deep well of that. How did you begin that journey? How did you get to that level?
Well, it started when a Muslim tried to convert me to Islam. So there was a Muslim who was a big fan of Ahmadiyyat, and he tried using Ahmadiyyat's arguments to try and convert me to Islam. And that resulted, and this was when I was like 13 years old, and that resulted in me starting a spiritual journey that led to me doing a direct comparison of the life of Jesus Christ, our Lord, and Muhammad, and just finding that, you know, Jesus Christ stood head and shoulders above Muhammad, and often at a person's conversion, God will infuse something into their soul, he'll infuse something into their hearts, and God infused something into my heart, which was a concern for Muslims, and a desire to see them saved. And they're a tough bunch, so you can't do evangelism without knowing your stuff or trying to know your stuff. It doesn't mean that I don't make mistakes. I certainly do. I might even make some in this presentation, but I try to honestly represent Islam, to criticize it, because I think that only honest representations of Islam can lead to fair criticism, and it's the fairest criticisms that will be the most effective, not misrepresentations. And unfortunately, that is how Muslims work in their da'i. They obviously, many of them misrepresent Christianity to spread Islam. And unfortunately, because of the dearth of apologetics within the Christian church, a lot of Christians and nominal Christians are duped by these very basic things.
That's true.
And so one of those issues is the question of hadith and Bible, and so hopefully we'll probe into that and we'll represent accurately the information concerning the hadiths and why it's problematic.
Well, I think knowing this topic and how polarizing it can be, whether you represent their views or misrepresent their views, I'm sure there's going to be criticisms one way or the other.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine it being any other way.
Yeah, well, feel free to get us going and take us through what these hadiths are, and we're really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a cursory skip. I just want to know how long have I got before you need to bring this to an end.
Oh, look, it really depends. Generally, these sort of podcasts are around 90 minutes that I do, but I'm very happy to go a bit longer if it suits.
Right.
There's no precisely time limit at all.
So what I'll do is I'll start off then by just giving a slight basic overview as to what hadiths are and how Muslims feel that they've secured hadiths, and then start to go into some of the problems connected to that, if that's okay. Yep. I'm not looking at you on screen at this moment, so I'm looking at my notes, and I'll be looking at notes off cameras and off computer as well, so I might be looking down from the camera. So I'll be relying on you to point out any problems or audio.
No, that's fine. I'll describe my facial reactions to you.
Right, okay. Brilliant. So let's start off with what hadiths are. Hadith it means like a report or a saying, a report about something, and the hadiths are meant to be records of what Muhammad did, what Muhammad permitted others to do, and what Muhammad said. And this corpus of literature goes into the tens of thousands of reports, hadith reports, most of which the Muslim community have rejected themselves. The remainder still is in the tens of thousands, but the vast majority of hadiths have been degraded or downgraded by Muslim scholars themselves as unreliable, and that should be your immediate first red flag. That Muslims admit that most hadiths are fake, or that most hadiths are not trustworthy or not reliable. But these hadiths are used by Muslim scholars to distill the Sunnah, and then the Sunnah is used to interpret the Qur'an. And so if the hadiths are not reliable, if that all of them, including the ones that Muslims think are reliable, if all of them are unreliable, then that means that we've got a situation that calls into question the very integrity of the Sunnah itself and the framework by which we interpret the Qur'an. So this criticism is not something that, from a Muslim perspective, should be easily dismissed. Now, there's a number of canonical hadith literature that have been collected by Muslims that are important to them, and so they've got a canon, particularly Sunni Muslims, that include Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan al-Nasai, Sunan Abi Dawud, Jami al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Ibn Majah, Muwatta Malik, Musnad Ahmed, Sunan ad-Darimi, and Nawawi 40 Hadith, the Riyad as-Salihin, Al-Adab al-Mufrad, Ash-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyah, Mishkat al-Masabi, Bulug al-Maram, other collections of the 40 in the Hisn al-Muslim. So these are like really important collections for Muslims. They're kind of like, you could compare them to the canon of our Bible. And again, a look at, and Muslims believe that these are trustworthy, particularly of prominence for Muslims, is Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim. And these were two Imams who lived, so Imam Muhammad al-Bukhari lived around 870 AD. And
how long precisely after Muhammad is that?
Well, Muhammad died in about 632, I think, from memory. So that's about 200 years after the event.
Wow.
Which is your second red flag.
Okay, so
they're massively after the events. Yes.
So these people were imams that have collated the sayings and teachings of Muhammad approximately 200 years after he died.
Correct. And
they have an issue with the New Testament documents, apparently.
That are less than 100 years after the life of Jesus. Yes, that is correct. They have an issue. Okay. And you're going to see why in a second. Because it all goes... But the second big name that we've got is Imam Muslim. So Imam Abu al-Hussein Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, who lived around 875 AD. These are the two biggest names in hadith literature, classically speaking at least. And their methodology came to kind of crystallize what was known as the science of hadiths. And the science of hadith is the means by which Muslims believe they have secured the authentic, reliable hadiths from the inauthentic, unreliable hadiths. Okay? And I'm going to explain basically the methodology of Muhammad al-Bukhari and of Hussein Muslim as well. So, starting with Imam Bukhari, one of his first important criteria was the al-ittisal, which is continuity. That is that the isnad, which is a list of names that are attached to any substantial hadith report, and the substantial hadith report is known as a matin, but the isnad is the list of names that secures that content as being reliable, as one person has transmitted it to another person, has transmitted it to another person, is the Islamic belief. And so Imam al-Bukhari, one of his criteria for identifying Sahih Hadith is that you've got a continuity, that the isnad is uninterrupted or mutasil, that there's no narrator from A, person B, person C, person D, person E at any point in the chain. And that that every narrator in the chain is considered adal or adel, which means upright. And this is from the concept of adala or integrity, i.e. that each person in the chain has proven piety and moral uprightness. And then another thing that Imam Bukhari seeks to establish is that each person in the chain has dat, and dat is precision, that everyone had a strong memory and was precise. Bukhari, for instance, wouldn't accept narrators unanimously. He would only accept narrators unanimously when it was the scholarly opinion that they had excellent memories and had sound reporting techniques. And then the final methodology of...
Just very quick, each person within that chain of narration, you said they themselves had to have an
excellent memory and sound reporting techniques.
Okay, it'll be interesting how you quantify that, but nonetheless, go on.
You've beat me to the punch, bro. Exactly. But let me just finish it, and then we'll form a critique of this, and we'll develop our critique as we go forward. So then, finally, the final criterion that Imam Bukhari used is what's called lika, and that's the idea of meeting, that each person in the chain had met the previous person in the chain to whom he claims to have heard the report, and so if he couldn't establish that two people had met, then he wouldn't say, he wouldn't give them the grade Sahih. Now you've already begun to see immediate problems. So for instance, how do we measure somebody's memory? How can we check that someone has a good memory? It's not something that is, what scientific method do we use to decide that someone has a good memory? Basically, it seems that the methodology to identifying that somebody has a good memory is just that there's no report that they forgot something. It is. It's not a particularly strong test, especially when you're doing it so far in the past, And And so you've got this, you've got this kind of situation where there is somewhat of a subjectivity to it, because each person in the chain, and let me just try to find my notes on it. Each person in the chain is said to have good memory based upon literature that talks about their life. So for each person, there's a book, a biography, that talks about the person's life and describes their qualities. Now, the problem with that is that these books were written even later than the hadiths themselves.
Oh, wow. I was just going to ask if there was any manuscript evidence whatsoever for each person in the chain. And this manuscript evidence exists later than the hadith themselves.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, is that for nearly 100 years, there was no systematic recording or copying of hadiths onto paper. And actually that seems to be rooted in a prohibition given by Muhammad himself in one of the hadiths, where Muhammad says, do not write anything of me, and those of you that have should destroy it, because all he wants is them to have the Qur'an. And so for 100 years, there's no systematic writing down of any hadiths. There's no systematic science of preservation. There are some hadiths that seem to have got written down, but very few in number. And so it is very easy within that 100 years for people to just invent stories, and no one would have been any the wiser, because it's not like it's documented anywhere for people to check, oh wait, this story didn't emerge until 70 years after Muhammad's death. What's going on there? They wouldn't have been able to do that process because it was an oral passing on with a few written incidents. And then after about 100 years, this science, of which the ultimate expression of which is the one that I've just explained through Imam Bukhari, and I'm going to go on to Imam Muslim as well, that develops, that starts to develop around 100 years after Muhammad's death, or 100 years after Hijrah, and then goes on for another 100 years before it becomes formalized and almost universally used, which means that there's about a 200 years gap where over the second 100 years it becomes harder and harder, but there's essentially a 200-year gap in which people can invent hadiths if they want to.
It appears that there certainly were hadiths invented about Muhammad, because they have the authentic versus unauthentic hadith traditions, right? There's sayings that they have that aren't attributed to Muhammad.
Well, yes, this is the point, is that there's massive dispute amongst Muslims about which hadiths are attributed to Muhammad and which aren't. So, and I just want to sort of tap into something. Bear with us one moment while I just find my notes.
Sure.
Okay. So, for instance, Muslims rely on a small collection of people for pretty much, Sunni Muslims rely on a small collection of people for pretty much all of their hadith literature. These are people like Abu Hurairah, Abdullah ibn Umar, Anas ibn Malik, Aisha bint Abu Bakr, Abdullah ibn Abbas, Jabri ibn Abdullah, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. And the numbers themselves that are connected to these people are highly suspect. So, if we look at the number of hadiths that are connected to them, Abu Hurairah has 5,374 hadiths. connected to him. Abdullah ibn Umar has 2,630. Anas ibn Malik has 2,286. Aisha bint Abu Bakr has 2,210. Abbas has 1,660. Abdullah has 1,540. And Al-Qudri has 1,170. So let me just ask you this question. Genuinely, without making up a lie or creating a number, if you were asked to write down how many individual true stories of your mother or of her words you can record accurately, how many do you think you could do?
It's a fascinating question.
Just off the top of your head, how many individual memories of your mum do you think you could record? Not conflagrations of memories where it's kind of like, oh, I've made her a coffee, I've made her 1,000 coffees, and so you just repeat that one memory that's really just a merged memory of a single event, you know. But actual individual stories.
Well, there's a few there of her chasing me around with a wooden spoon when I was younger. Yeah. But it's a fascinating question. I don't know. I mean, surely with my own mother, you would think you could get to 100 stories.
There you go. Yeah, and pretty much everyone I ask that question to, right, is going to say about the same. But then just think about the numbers that I've just read to you, right? Think about the significance of the numbers that I've just read to you. Like, Abu Hurairah is claiming to have 5,374 individual reports about Muhammad.
Yeah, well.
That doesn't make any sense, right? Now, a lot of those reports are duplicates, you know. And if you take away the repetitions, the numbers drop, but they're still pretty much all of above 1,000. And this is incredulous. Like, you know, Muslims don't use the argument of miracles when it comes to hadith reports. And if they were arguing that Allah provided some kind of miracle, then, you know, they'd have some kind of defense. But they are saying that these are just human beings being human beings with normal human memories. But nobody remembers like this. You know, if you were remembering these kinds of stories, if you were remembering, like, let's take Aisha bint Abu Bakr, there's 1,200 unique hadiths connected to her when you take away repetitions and duplications. Those memories, for her to remember them, would mean that she'd have to be going through her entire life consciously trying to remember everything that Muhammad did, and then remembering what he did yesterday and what he did the day before and what he did the day before that, and going back over the memories again and again and again. But people don't do that, do they? That's not how memory works, is it?
No, not at all. Not at all. And
now, go on.
No, go on.
Well, but the other problem is you've got people like Abu Hurairah, right? Bearing in mind that his number of unique reports is between 1,500 and 1,700, right? He only knew the Prophet for 2 years. So that means in about 365, so in about 700 days, and you can do the maths here, in about 700 days he's remembering between 1,500 and 1,700 memories. How many memories is that a day? How is he going to record and keep that kind of information? Bearing in mind, when they were writing down the Qur'an, they couldn't even find paper for the Qur'an. They were writing it down on bones, they were writing it down on leaves, they were writing it down on stone slate. And yet we're supposed to believe that Abu Hurairah records 1,500 to 1,700 unique hadiths when he's only in the company of the Prophet for 700 days. Do you see the problem?
Yeah.
Right?
It's
the other problem is that... Go on.
No, go.
The other problem is that a lot of these recorders like Umar, Malik, Bakr, Abbas, Abdullah, Al-Qudri, they're all children. Some of their memories are back in childhood and through teenage years. And yet we're supposed to think that their memories was of such a nature that they would be able to remember things from their childhood, everyday things, right? Long speeches, instructions on particulars when they're children. Like, does that ring true for you or for anyone you know, that they can remember thousands of episodes of individual memories concerning everyday particulars, instructions, refusals, long speeches, going back from when they were 10 years old?
Listen, I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old daughter, and I can tell you now, their memories are not as good as one would think.
Right.
They struggle to remember because children are all about experience. It's an experiential childhood. There's a whole variety of other senses that are far more they're developing. They're not fully developed anyway. So yeah, it doesn't make sense. So basically, we've got a smoking gun here, haven't we? We've got a smoking gun that smacks of incredulity. It smacks of something that can't be believed unless you're going to appeal to the miraculous. But Muslims do not appeal to the miraculous. So therefore, this is in the realm of normal human behaviour, and therefore it is subject to normal human conditions and thoughts. Now, into that flux, right, you've got to imagine that the Muslim empire explodes around the world as they invade and colonize. The Arab Muslims invade and colonize other people's lands in Assyria, with the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, in Lebanon, the Christians of Egypt, and of all North Africa and so on, as they explode around the world in this violent eruption in which they conquer and colonize other people's lands. And into that explosion, this empire suddenly now needs to come up with a law code. It needs to decide things based upon the example of their prophet that they've been following and that they've been instructed to follow. And this is one of the reasons why I disagree with Dr. J. Smith, who argues that Muhammad never existed, right? Because why refer back to a fictional character when you're geographically spread out, but you're all trying to justify what you're doing by referring back to the same geographical character? So this creates and this sits in a milieu in which we know that people have a habit of falsely attributing things to people who are famous. So, for example, go back 2,000 years. How many false gospels were created and attached to one of the apostles, like Peter, or Thomas, or Barnabas, or or other gospels that were given, said to be from Jesus. Do you see what I'm saying? So we live in a milieu in which people invent stories and then attach them to famous things. This is not something that's unique to Christians. Clearly pagans did it, Jews did it. And we've got no reason to think that Muslims wouldn't have done it either. And actually, Muslims themselves admit that Muslims were inventing false stories. Remember, right at the beginning, the very first thing that I said was the Muslim scholars themselves reject over 90% of all hadiths as being somehow unreliable or faulty. Right? Now, add to that pressure the fact that you've got sectarian differences between different groups of Muslims, like Sunnis and Shia,
and Sunnis and Shia and Khawarij, and if you believe them, the Sufis as well, and if you believe them, the Ibadis as well. And you've got all these different sects of Islam emerging. And then you've got political rivalries, like between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. Okay? There is sectarian reasons why you would start inventing stories. There's sectarian pressure to invent stories.
Is
right?
there fundamental difference between those different sects regarding their hadith collections or their authoritative hadith sayings?
Sorry, ask the question again, sorry.
So the differing sects, like the Sunni and the Shias, I'm assuming here they all have the same Qur'an, so to speak, or similar recitation. Is the fundamental differences in their belief structures come down to the hadiths?
Yes. Yeah, the Quran, the variants of the Quran, and there are versions of the Quran, there are variants of the Quran, but the variance between different Qurans is minimal enough that you couldn't invent a radically different version of Islam just on the Quran alone, unless you use the Quran alone. You'd have to create a different version of Islam. You'd have to reject all hadiths completely. And actually,
there are people that do.
Yeah.
I'm actually doing an interview with one of them soon enough.
Yeah.
But it appears that there's dilemmas in that, because their 5 daily prayers and the pilgrimages and certain things that are considered orthodoxy within Islam are from the hadiths, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is all down to the hadiths that create the different sects, and that also, and
they're
the
a huge
different
part of Islamic epistemology. Then,
huge, massive,
yeah,
massive, and the reality is that the Sunnis and the Shia have different canons of hadith. So Shia, for instance, notoriously are quite suspicious of hadiths that come from Aisha, and yet for Sunnis, Aisha's absolutely fundamental to hadith reporting.
Why are they suspicious of Aisha's hadith?
I'm not going to guess. I'm not entirely sure. I think it will have something to do with... I suspect it'll have something to do with the split from Ali, and how perhaps Aisha supported the other caliphs over Ali. That's my guess, but I'm not entirely sure. But they would justify it through pointing out things like, there's a hadith report in Sahih al-Bukhari, or it might be Sahih Muslim, where it appears in the hadith that Aisha is deliberately lying to Muhammad to deceive him, saying he's got bad breath when he hasn't.
Okay.
And because she's doing that, she's doing it to try and manipulate him, so that he'll stop visiting another woman whom she doesn't like. The fact that Muhammad's spending all this attention with another woman, and so she makes up and conspires to make up a story about when Muhammad goes to this other woman and drinks a certain honey drink, that it gives him bad breath and she doesn't like it. And it's just a manipulative story. And so the Shia will often use this hadith to justify. But the point that brings up is that Shia and Sunni don't even have the same collection of hadiths. Like they often go, how many different Bibles you've got? Well, I mean, that backfires dramatically, because it's how many different canon of hadith do you have? Sunnis and Shias don't agree anymore, and than Roman Catholics and Protestants do, about how many books are in the Bible. But the differences between the Sunnis and the Shia is far greater than the differences between Protestants and Catholics in terms of how many books that we've got, and also whether they're good to read or not. Because obviously the magisterial reformers had no problem with reading the deuterocanonical books, or the Apocrypha, as it's known to some. So that's one of it. The other point that we've got, that we've touched upon, is that the hadiths, and I'm leaning at this again, is not something that I'm just making up. This is what scholars are mentioning, like Dr. Joshua Little, who's a scholar of hadiths, and a lot of my own research is leaning on scholars like Dr. Joshua Little, Dr. Brown, who's a Muslim hadith scholar, and other things, and other scholars that I can pick up on. So I'm not claiming to do unique research here. I'm learning and I'm regurgitating, essentially.
Yep.
But for instance, the lateness of the hadith collections, some of the earliest writings that historians are aware of comes from Ibn Ishaq in his Kitab al-Maghazi, and he died around 767 AD, and that was a full 135 years after Muhammad died himself. But we don't have his original material, right? We don't have his original work, even though there's no excuse why not, because by this point Muslims have a giant empire, they have the resources of an empire, they have the ability to create copies of books just like the Byzantines did. The earliest copies of the Bible come from the 4th century. Why do you think they come from the 4th century? Because that's when the Roman Empire legalized Christianity, and that's when the Roman Empire became Christian. And so, boom, the moment we've got the resources of the empire, what happens? Bibles get made, and we now have full copies of Bibles, right? But in the Islamic world, they have an empire from the 7th century, but yet they don't even have copies of their earliest books by Ibn Ishaq, who was in the latter part of the 8th century. What's going on? Why is the material missing? The only thing that we've got is that we've got references to his material from the 9th century by his students and their students. And so you've got and so, for example, you have these compilation of hadith like the Muwatta of Ibn Malik, which was written about 150 years after the death of Muhammad. But they had an empire within decades after Muhammad's death. Now, what is this telling us? It's telling us that Muslims didn't care much about keeping their books. And so that leans into this idea that there was this tradition of we shouldn't be writing down hadiths, we just keep the book of God.
Interesting.
There's this famous story of when the Muslims entered into Egypt, the great library of Alexandria, or at least what was left of it, was being destroyed by Muslims, and somebody pointed that out to the commander, saying, this library with all these great books is being burnt and destroyed in the siege, in the war, in the conflict. And he turned around and said, what need have we of their books? We've got the book of God.
Yeah, everything you're saying here. I only recently came across Yassir Qadi, they're one of the prominent Islamic scholars, and made that comment online that seemed to go around like wildfire, that the hadiths don't stand the historical critical test amongst the academic community. And he admitted this thing, and everything you're saying now. And I'm a fan of textual criticism. I like studying the work of critical scholarship. I think from a Christian and non-Christian perspective, there's plenty of things I've learnt from Dr. Bart Ehrman, and I find the art form elucidates history in such a unique fashion, trying to give an accurate depiction of what transpired in history. And so that method, when you just mentioned things about the memory and the chain of narration and any documentation trying to support it that was written much later, it would never stand the test. It's not something that can be taken seriously, because you can make up any story, as we've said here. So it's fascinating.
So, I mean, the issue is right. The stories about Muhammad rest upon an isnad. And then every person in that isnad, so isnad means list of names for the sake of the layman, right? So every hadith matin which is the substance, every hadith matin rests upon an isnad to get back to Muhammad or whoever was the companion that said so and so and such and such. But then your knowledge of those people in that isnad requires an isnad itself. How do you know that such and such a person in that list of chain had a good memory? You know, like, and on what basis and on what system of reporting are you securing the report about the person in the isnad? And then this goes into what's called, like, it just ends up being ridiculous, because then you need an isnad for each person that's making a report about one of the people in the isnad, because what validates them to make that judgment? Do you see the problem?
Exactly.
It's all built upon the isnad, but the isnad collapses, and nothing demonstrates this more than the work of Albani. So Albani was a very recent Muslim scholar. He's beloved of the Salafi. And Albani wrote a book called Da'if al-Jami. And Da'if al-Jami was, was looking at what were considered, it was a revision of what we could consider to be sound hadiths. And I'll just explain my point. So he looked at, for instance, hadith Qudsis. So hadith Qudsi is when it's said that Allah himself has spoken. So it's a speech of Allah or the command of Allah, but it's not recorded in the Qur'an because it's not his direct speech, but rather Muhammad has expressed the direct command of Allah in his own words. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's hadith Qudsi. Yeah, whereas the Qur'an is Allah's words, hadith Qudsi are Allah's commands in Muhammad's words. So hadith Qudsi is the closest thing to our understanding of the Bible. Yeah, which is the words of God, the will of God written in the words of men. Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, Al-Bani goes through Imam Bukhari's work and other great scholars, and he contradicts them. So, for instance, Sahih Bukhari 2227 is graded as sound by Imam Bukhari, but Albani in Da'if al-Jami grades it weak. Nasai is graded, Nasai 4378 is graded sound by Ali Zai, but is graded weak by Albani. It's also graded sound by Imam Muslim, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, and Nasai himself. So who's right? Hadith Sahih al-Muslim 1437a is graded sound by Imam Muslim, but it's graded weak by Albani. Sahih Muslim 768 is graded sound by Imam Muslim, but it's graded weak by Albani. Sahih Muslim 1437b is graded sound by Muslim, but it's graded weak by Albani. So who's right? Like, the Muslim scholars themselves, using their science, are disagreeing about which hadiths you can believe, about which hadiths are strong or which hadiths are weak. And so what it's showing to us is that really the whole science of hadith really is just opinions. It's just, there's nothing scientific about it.
It's just somewhat arbitrary, of course.
Yeah, completely. And so it's a completely subjective science being used by these scholars. Another thing that highlights the irreliability of the hadiths is that they contradict. Now, what I mean by that is, for instance, you've got reports in Bukhari and Muslim that give different ages of Muhammad: 60, 63, 65. You've got hadiths that talk about, let me just pull up some of the notes and I'll give you an example. Bear with us. So, for example, you've got hadiths like, let me just find it for you. So, for instance, the exchange of gold, right? So in Bukhari, volume 3, book 34, number 344, we read this, that the latter said, who has change? Talha said, I will have change when our storekeeper comes from the forest. Narrated Umar bin al-Khattab, Allah's apostle, said, the bartering of gold for silver is riba, usury, except if it is from hand to hand and equal in amount. And wheat grain for wheat grain is usury, except if it is in the form of hand to hand and in equal amount. And dates for dates is usury, except if it is from hand to hand and equal in amount. And barley for barley is usury, except it is from hand to hand and equal in amount. Bukhari, volume 3, book 34, number 388. So that's within Imam Bukhari's own book, and this is the issue. Says this, that his father said, the Prophet forbade the selling of gold for gold and silver for silver, except if they are of equivalent weight, and allowed us to sell gold for silver and vice versa as we wished. So in Bukhari 334, 344, it says, except if it is from hand to hand and in equal amount. But in Bukhari 334, 388, there is no restriction on how gold is sold for silver. And so you've got contradictions within the hadiths. Now, the thing is, Muslim scholars are aware of these contradictory rulings within the hadith corpus, and they obviously work it and they come to a conclusion and they decide, well, actually it's this one rather than that one. Like, for instance, the age of the Prophet, is he 60, 63 or 65? Well, they work their subjective magic opinions and then they come to a conclusion that they feed out to the ummah, the people, the Muslim, and the Muslims lap it up and the ulama go away thinking very clever. But the point is, they only realized that there was an error in the hadith corpus because of a synoptic contradiction. So in other words, they would not have known that the hadith that they said, oh, this is the one that's got the error in it, had the error in it unless there had been a synoptic contradiction for them to go, oh, look, there's a contradiction here, one of these can't be right.
Yep.
Which means that we've got clear evidence that in the Sahih collection, there are fake hadiths that have been called Sahih. Right? Which begs the question, how many hadith reports are in the collection where there's no synoptic contradiction, so you can't spot that that it's an error? Did you follow me on that?
Yeah.
Yeah? The fact that you've got these contradictions in the reports is exactly what we would expect to see if, because of communal tensions and sectarian tensions and denominational differences and political differences, people are making up hadiths. Yeah?
Yeah. Well.
Right? We've got an example of that we can look at, which is in Sahih al-Bukhari. Sahih al-Bukhari number 6. Now, it's a long hadith. I'm not going to read the whole hadith. But it's a report by Abu Sufyan bin Harb, who reported to Abdullah bin Abbas, right, that he had met with Heraclius. And it goes on to this long conversation about Heraclius inquiring as to this Prophet Muhammad and whether he thought that this prophet was true, and then getting a letter from the prophet that he read, and then having a dream, and him himself becoming convinced that that Muhammad is a real prophet, right? But there's clear evidence within this hadith that the whole hadith is just fake. Okay?
Did you
Let me
say that
just
he wrote a
find it.
letter?
He received a letter from Muhammad. Remember, Muhammad had scribes.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah? So just the fact that it's from Muhammad doesn't mean Muhammad wrote it. Paul wrote letters, but he didn't write them all. So sure. let's not get caught up on that. It's a minor point. Right, so let's just bear with us. I'm just finding it because it's a huge hadith and I just want to find the bit that's relevant. Right. So after a long interview, reading the letter, he goes on. Heraclius, remember, this is a report by a guy called Abu Sufyan, right? So Abu Sufyan's just an Arab merchant. Yeah, he's not royalty. He's certainly not any part of the Roman elites or the Roman establishment. But the hadith goes on to say that Heraclius then left for Homs. He was previously in Jerusalem, a town in Syria, and stayed there till he received the reply of his letter from his friend, who agreed with him in his opinion about the emergence of the prophet. Right, that immediately tells you that this is a fake. Because how on earth does Ibn Sufyan know about the personal correspondence of a Roman emperor? Do you see why that's immediately fake?
Yeah.
Yeah? And so then Heraclius in this hadith calls a meeting of all the Byzantine elites to his palace in Homs, and then says that we should all become Muslim, of which all of them start running for the gates and saying that they're never going to become Muslim. And then he says to them, no, I was only kidding. Actually, I just wanted to test your resolve. Right? Now, the thing is, if you know anything about Heraclius was the man that defeated the Persian Empire to defend the Christian Empire and return the true cross. Right? This man was a crusader before the Crusades. He was a fully committed Christian. He when he set off on his army to invade Persia because they'd captured Jerusalem and taken the true cross. He went off on his march and he had choirs singing. The guy was religious to the core and a Christian to the core. He's a Christian hero amongst the Byzantine Roman Christians, right? A man and a legend in his own lifetime, and a legend to later Christians because of what he accomplished. Because he managed to turn back the Persian Empire when it looked like the Persian Empire was going to utterly destroy the Byzantine Empire, right? So the guy's a living legend, right? So why then do you think that 200 years later there might be a story that says even Heraclius wanted to become a Muslim, when Muslims had just conquered a largely Christian empire, where the Christians there were looking for the next Heraclius, thinking that there'll be a new Heraclius that will overturn these Muslim Arabs, just like Heraclius overturned the Persians? It's propaganda, isn't it?
Yeah, wow.
Yeah?
And this is within Sahih al-Bukhari.
And this is in Sahih al-Bukhari. So it's clearly a propaganda piece that's given to try and discourage Christians in the Middle East, for them to think that actually there's going to be another hero. No, even your hero wanted to be Muslim. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Herbert Berg said on the issue of contradictions, it is not uncommon for Ibn Abbas hadiths to present 3 or even 4 contradictory interpretations of the same verse. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
wow.
And we've talked about propagandist reports of this. So I'll just read from Jonathan Brown. Jonathan Brown's one of the scholars. He's a Muslim scholar. So this is Jonathan Brown speaking, a Muslim scholar on hadith. He says this: I'm not suggesting that hadith critics like al-Bukhari or Ibn Hanbal were forerunners of the historical critical method, as generations of Western scholars have demonstrated. Even the revered Sahihain, that's the Sahih reporters, Bukhari and Muslim, are replete with anachronistic reports that grew out of political, legal, and sectarian feuds of the 2 centuries of Islam. And that's what Sahih al-Bukhari number 6 is an example of.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah? Right? So if you've got these fake hadiths coming in, right, that Imam Bukhari is saying is true, is reliable, then you know, you've got real problems
it questions
in the Sahih collection.
It calls into questions his entire methodology by which he determines authenticity. I mean, anyone would see that. That's not a... If you were duped into believing this was authentic, then it questions your ability as a historian. However, if you are saying this is authentic for political purposes, then the whole source material needs to be questioned for if it was done for political gain. So yeah, wow. But what did Muslims say when you bring any of this up?
Well, so far they just go, "I'm not an expert of hadiths, I can't talk about it." But they're always experts of talking about the Bible. It's like, I can't talk about the hadiths, I can't talk about the problems you've identified in the hadiths because I'm not an expert. I can't talk about problems you've identified in the Qur'an because I'm not an expert. But I found these problems in the Bible. And it's like,
Can I just say this? If I were to give an analogy to a Christian layman wanting to learn about Islam and what the hadiths are, in many ways the way you described them, they're almost like the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, like the collections of the sayings and teachings of Jesus, insofar that they're not considered inspired, the hadiths within Islamic culture, but it does have the collections and sayings of Muhammad. Would that be analogous with one another in terms of how to describe what they are, not necessarily the epistemology behind it?
Yeah, the hadiths are the closest thing that we've got in Islam to the Bible, but the comparison's not exact.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
Because we believe that the Bible is the words of men that captures the inspiration of God.
Yeah.
So God inspires, and men write in their own words what God is doing, who God is, how God wants us to live. The closest thing in hadith literature is you've got hadith Qudsi, which is where Allah gives a command and then Muhammad repeats the command but uses his own words.
Okay, that would be a better analogy.
That would be the closest, but even that is not a like for like comparison.
Of course.
You know,
but the in terms of the historicity of the gospel accounts, you know, we can bring the critical scholarship now, for instance, with Mark is anywhere between 66 to 70 AD.
Yeah.
You know, 1 Corinthians 53, 54 AD. We're talking within 25 years.
Yeah.
You know, of Jesus. There's always contention about Matthew and Luke. To me, just very briefly here, I've never heard a very good critical response as to why someone like Luke, wanting to give a historical account, would leave out the deaths of, say, Peter and Paul, or leave out the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD if it was written in the 80s. I haven't actually heard a good response for that. And there's been great
especially when Luke makes a point of when a prophecy's been fulfilled, he actually points out, this prophecy has been fulfilled.
Exactly, and he records Luke 21, so the Olivet Discourse. So the interesting part about all of it is there is some great scholarship that you could say definitively that anywhere between 25 years to essentially 50, 60 years of Jesus, we have the New Testament corpus. Now that is really close.
But Muslims will just go, but you don't know who authored it. And this comes to the heart of the matter, is that for Muslims, everything about the hadiths is built on the isnads. Right? The whole science about the hadiths builds on isnads. It's all about isnads. And they think that gives them some golden ticket. Well, the problem is, as we're pointing out, is their isnads haven't safeguarded their hadith collection from clear forgeries, fakes, contradictions, and errors. And that's just talking about the Sahih ones, the ones that they said were reliable compilations. So their isnad material doesn't work, but they'll just attack the Bible, saying, "Well, you don't know who wrote Matthew, you don't know who wrote Mark, you don't know who wrote Luke," because they're not aware of the fact that we don't need an isnad for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because the isnad is literally one. How do you write an isnad? Like, who? Mark. Oh yeah. Who told you your stories, Mark? Peter did. And where did Peter get his stories from? He walked with Jesus. Like, that's literally the longest isnad that we would have.
Yeah, I mean, and the unanimity amongst church fathers as to who the gospel writers were.
Yeah,
it's quite interesting. But
you might argue about Luke, and it's like, Luke, who told you your stories? And it's like, well, Mary told me the stories about the birth, and then the apostles that I met in Jerusalem told me the rest. Or like I had seen it in a report that was based upon Mark. Because if you read Luke, he talks about, as others had written before us. I have sought to carefully compile.
He's such a gift, Luke. He's a first century fact checker. And if anything, you can, from the we passages, derive that it's, potentially Luke himself.
The thing that gives Luke veracity is just how much of his history he gets right.
Yeah,
like the little details, the details that he gets, covering great regions, bearing in mind that he wouldn't have had access to all of the regions that these stories are based in. Remember, because in Acts, his panorama is all across the Mediterranean, and when he's writing his gospel, his panorama is all across Israel. Well, but yet Luke's information about the region, about the events that's going on, and the people and the places are hold up well. I'm trying to keep myself in frame.
No, that's all right.
Like they hold up really well. You might argue that he got 1 or 2 points wrong, but that would only be if you assume, for instance, that you're going to believe Josephus over Luke. On certain points where Luke and Josephus contradict.
That whole thing about Quirinius is quite interesting. The analysis of that, when you look at the fact that he was proconsul, and how Luke actually talks about not necessarily governing. He was a governor at the time, but he was a ruler at a time, conducting military campaigns. There's answers for that with regards to Quirinius being governor and the dating of the birth and what have you. Luke is. But
I just want to show to you that the science of isnad, right, or the science of hadith that's connected to the science, the science of isnad, or that is a part of the science of hadith, right? That itself is highly disputed, okay, and problematic. Because Muslims say, well, you don't have a chain, you don't have anywhere that it says, you don't have anything clear where it says that Mark got it from Peter, despite the fact that there are church fathers that say that, but then they'll go, oh, but they said it much later. Ironically, they're in exactly the same boat, but they just don't see it. Their biographies about the people in the isnad chains are written much, much later than anyone in the isnad chains. But I just want to point out something, right? So I'll use an actual example. Okay, so Ikrimah is someone who appears in the hadith chains of Sahih al-Bukhari. Okay, now Ikrimah was a Kharijite, and a Kharijite was an extremist sect that broke away from Ali, who when Ali was in contention with other Muslims about whether he was the rightful caliph or not. And important hadiths that have real world implications are connected through Ikramah. So, for example, the hadith that says kill gays, by burning them or chucking them off buildings, that's rooted through Ikramah. The one that says kill apostates for Christians that have left Islam, it's because of a report through Ikramah that we get these, and these appear in Sahih al-Bukhari. Okay? Now, what's interesting is you've got, in fact, I'll come back to that. Now, you've got differences amongst different hadith compilers about whether they can trust Ikramah. So, for instance, Imam Malik doubted Ikramah, and he only used him once, because he could find another hadith with a separate chain which didn't include Ikramah that said the same thing. Right? Ahmad ibn Hanbal called Ikramah as an Ibadiyah. He called him, so that's Abu Bakr Abi Kaithama, and I'm sorry for anyone who's Arab, I'm slaughtering your language, I'm not doing it on purpose. He said that Yahya ibn Ma'in said that Ikramah was of the sect of the Karaji. Right? That means that he would have been considered a deviant, so he didn't have upstanding, he wasn't upright. He wasn't morally right because he wasn't practicing Islam correctly. Do you get me? Right? Mm-hmm. So if these accusations against Ikramah that he's a Karijite or a Karaji or an Ibadiyah, that would mean that he would be considered a deviant, which means that he doesn't have what Imam Bukhari said that he needed to have, which is uprightness, moral virtue, true religion. Okay? And yet, Imam Bukhari uses him hundreds of times. Yeah? And Imam Bukhari uses him because Ikramah is a link to Ibn Abbas in the stem of the isnad. So who's right? Was it Imam Bukhari or was it Imam Malik? So Imam Bukhari said that nobody doubted Ikramah, that nobody doubts Ikramah, stating that he was upright, and he used him for hundreds of narrations. But yet Muhammad ibn Ali al-Madini, Abbas al-Duri, Ibrahim bin al-Muthir al-Hizami all say that Imam Malik didn't trust Ikramah as a source. And so even in the discussions around who is in the isnad, there's evidence that great Muslim scholars couldn't agree about who you could trust and who you couldn't trust.
Yeah.
And that's within the same sect. Imam Malik and Sahih al-Bukhari are both Sunnis, and they couldn't agree. And that's before you add on to the fact that the Shia wouldn't agree about the isnad of the Sunni, and the Sunni won't agree about the isnads of the Shia. Right? So who's correct, Bukhari or Imam Malik? Yeah? Imam Malik is the founder of the madhab, which is an Islamic school of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, whereas Bukhari is one of the great collectors of hadith. So these are big heavyweights in the Muslim world. Yeah? And they can't agree. And then remember, you've got Albani disagreeing with pretty much all the major collectors, saying what we can and we can't trust. Now, what's really interesting, which brings us to another example of is false prophecy in the hadith. So, in Ibn Majah 176, let me just see if I can get it up for you. Bear with me 1 second.
Mm-hmm. Quick note, did Muhammad ever make a prophecy?
Oh, loads. In the hadiths.
In the hadith. In the Qur'an?
I'm gonna pass on that.
Okay.
Because off the top of my head I can't remember. So let me just get to 176. Is this correct? Sorry, let me just... That's not working. I'm trying to use... let's do it this way. Right. Abu Ghalib narrated that Abu Ummah said that the Khawarij are the worst of the slain who are killed under heaven, and the best of the slain are those who are killed by them. Those Khawarij are the dogs of hell. These people were Muslims, but they became disbelievers. I said, O Abu Umama, is that your opinion? He said, rather, I heard it from the Messenger of Allah. Now, this is an example of prophecy, right? So Muhammad is talking about a group that doesn't exist yet, because the Khawarij only emerge when the Sunni Shia sect division starts, and that happens after Muhammad dies, right? And it happens with Ali, when Ali starts battling against, I think it's Muawiyah, I probably slaughtered the name there, for the caliphate, okay? And the Khawarij sort of break off from Ali's camp because Ali agrees to negotiate, he agrees to a compromise. And the Khawarij are like fanatics, and it's like, well, there's no compromise. And the Khawarij are fanatics who think that, you know, even minor sins make you a non-Muslim, and that means that you're an apostate and therefore you can be killed. And they're really quite an awful group. But this hadith is saying that Allah specifically is speaking about this group. Yeah? The worst of the slain are those under heaven who are killed. The Khawarij are the worst of the slain who are killed under heaven, and the best of the slain are those who were killed by them. Those Khawarij are the dogs of hell. So Allah's prophet is prophesying very specifically about a specific group, correct? But the point is, the hadiths that make that prophecy come after Muhammad. So in other words, they come after the Khawarij. And so the prophecy can be very specific, because the hadith doesn't get written down until hundreds of years after the Khawarij, after Muhammad. And so it's very easy to put very specific prophecies into the mouth of Muhammad. But what's interesting is the moment that the hadith sciences take a grip of the Islamic world towards the end of the 2nd century after Hijrah, the prophecies that are found in Muhammad's mouth become less specific and more vague. But before that point, when they're talking about events prior to this development in hadith science and this development of hadiths, i.e. around, you know, before that, they're very specific, naming individuals, naming individual groups, talking about their behaviours. And it's just like, well, that's a bit suspicious, isn't it?
Naturally.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Let me. So, for example, you know, you've got different prophecies in the hadith. Some that are very precise and some that are very ambiguous. Those that are very precise, the events that occurred are all universally before the 9th century. So when Muhammad gives it an exact prophecy, it's all before the 9th century. And then the 9th century comes along, and all the prophecies that point to something after the 9th century, not before the 9th century, i.e. someone's writing history, you end up getting vague prophecies. Now, isn't that curious? It's because when the hadith sciences start to take grip, it becomes very hard to invent hadiths.
It's so funny, even just from a critical standpoint, you'll find that within the Gospels, as you're probably aware, that the critical scholarship will look at, say, the Olivet Discourse and go, that's very accurate about Jerusalem. Therefore, it must have been written after 70 AD because of the fall of Jerusalem. So they recognize the accuracy of those prophecies and date them afterwards. And it's
except that when you look at the writings of the Gospels, when prophecies are fulfilled, they often, we could maybe look at this in a separate podcast maybe, but when you look at prophecies that are fulfilled within the lifetime of the writers, they point it out. They're quite excited to point it out. Like the famine, I think it's the famine in Acts. So the famine in Acts, I'm going off memory here, so I might be wrong. People don't
under Claudius.
Yeah, but the famine that's recorded in Acts was prophesied, and then Luke goes, and this fulfilled the prophecy, or in fulfillment of the prophecy. So he points out that it's fulfilled.
It's true.
When the gospel writers don't understand the prophecy, they go something like, let the reader understand, because I'm clueless. But when they do understand, they go, hey, look, this was prophesied. So that tells you actually that, the destruction of Jerusalem, if the destruction of Jerusalem would have been celebrated as a fulfilled prophecy.
Oh, it was the 9/11 of the first century. It was would have certainly left an impact on everyone. Actually, just briefly off topic, one of the reasons that the Gospels, at least Mark now, looks like it's written prior to 70 AD, was because there's no mention of the fire that Josephus mentions that burnt down the temple, and they think fire is very divine, righteous judgment, something that leaves an impact in your memory. And the fact that there's no fire in the Olivet Discourse, it means that, at least in Mark, it would have had to have been written prior, possibly 68, 69 AD now. That's from the critical. It's very, very, very intriguing.
It's maybe something we could do an entire podcast on. We could talk. about
look, I think I could talk with you for hours, Bob. We could.
How long have you got? Shall I continue?
Well, I think because normally we come up to about, we're coming up to close to about 90 minutes.
Can I finish on one more?
Yeah, of course.
Because I've mentioned about the problem of the isnads, right? Because you've got to understand, right? For Muslims, the reason why they don't trust the Gospels is because, as far as they're concerned, there's no isnad. The reason why they trust their hadiths, despite the fact that other Muslims don't trust their hadiths, and that never seems to, land with them, is that the Muslims believe that their isnad secure the hadiths. So I want to point out a problem with the hadiths, right? Is that the requirement for the chain of transmitters, the isnad, as the determining factor to the credibility of the hadith, only arises during a fitna, or the second fitna, as Muslims call it, which is a reaction to the rebellion of Muqta in 685 to 687 AD in Kufa. And because of that is what starts off the development of isnads. But it takes time to take a grip of Muslim culture. It doesn't just come out and then suddenly everybody's using it. It takes another 100 years before it becomes commonplace and well established, and then a science to start developing around it comes even later than that. And so that means that the practice didn't become commonplace of isnad use and isnad checking until the mid-8th century, about 750 AD, right? Over 100 years after Muhammad's death. Which means that by that time, because of the many competing interest groups, both political and religious, both within a sect and between sects, within political parties and between political parties, you would end up with a very easy, a lot of pressure to come up with answers, come up with rulings, and then to back that up with a hadith report, and no way to check it. So I'll just quote Sahih Muslim's introduction. He says this: Abu Jafar Muhammad bin Usabah narrated to us that Ismail bin Zakaria narrated to us on authority of Asim in al-Wal, on authority of Ibn Sirin, that he said, they would not ask about the chains of narration. And when the fitna occurred, they said, name for us your men. So al-Sunnah would be regarded, and their hadith were then taken, and Hal-ul-Bid'ah would be regarded, and their hadith were not taken. So in other words, depending on which sect you were in, you would end up having these established isnads that you would trust, and any that belonged to the other sect you would reject. But no one was even asking those questions. No one was even really concerned in that way until after the second fitna of the late 7th century, the latter part of the 7th century, which is a good, which is decades after Muhammad has already died, and it takes time for these isnads to develop, and anyone can chuck in any story at this point, because once you've established, oh well, this is an isnad that my sect uses and that people trust, well, I can just stick a story onto that, can't I, and use that isnad.
Yeah, that's actually true. That's why you could just copy the isnads and plagiarize them.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's total subjective, arbitrary nonsense ultimately to try and tie these sayings back. And the isnads themselves, requires, you mentioned before, will require isnads.
Yeah. I just want to quote from a hadith scholar called Motsky, right? And he said this: studies have shown that the custom of asking one's teacher about their informants arose at the end of the 1st century after Hijrah, and then slowly spread in the course of the 2nd century after Hijrah. In Mecca, asking about an isnad didn't begin until the start of the 2nd century. In Iraq, it was even later. And it's all the big compilers, they're coming from Iraq, they're coming from Iran, they're coming from that region.
Yeah, wow.
And so if your entire reason for believing hadiths is because of isnad, but isnads came too late to stop forgeries, and we have clear evidence that there are forgeries and errors in your Sahih compilation, then the whole compilation can't be trusted.
Agreed on that.
Because the science that developed to try and protect it came too late.
Agreed. But even the science that does protect it doesn't stand the test of the historical critical method ultimately. So,
well, yeah,
I guess within their own belief system, though, within their own belief structure, it doesn't appear to stand the test.
Yeah,
that's fascinating.
I can keep going, bro, but I don't know if you want to keep going, because you only said 1 hour 90.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes or so, and I wouldn't mind asking you just a couple questions. Look, I'd love to do another podcast with you. It'd be great.
I mean, you're a theologian, right? You do theology.
Oh well, it's like call a. I use this analogy where you got law students that graduate out of their degrees and they call themselves lawyers. You ain't a lawyer yet, boy. You need to spend some time in the field before you do that. And knowing all the people and different scholars I've interviewed, that's just a whole nother level. All I can do is regurgitate some brilliant work, and maybe every now and again I may have an opinion on something.
Yeah. To be fair, when it comes to isnad and my study of the isnad, I'm at the beginning of it. So I'm in the same place. I'm regurgitating other people's work and having my own opinions in addition.
Well, this is half the battle, because what you've been able to do today, which is great, is, for someone who's a layman who's just really getting into this, wanting to understand the ecosystem and the epistemic foundation by which they go, okay, how do I reason this together in order for it to coincide with my worldview, my belief structure? And I think you've illustrated quite a lot of flaws in their presuppositions when it comes to the hadiths, which is very fascinating. And now, look, I know that there's more, but generally with the algorithm here, you've got to do these in certain episode lots, and I'd love to have you back. I think it's been fantastic and very informative, and thank you very much for making the time. I just got a couple rapid-fire questions from our audience for you, and by our audience, I mean directly from me. Okay. Things that I'm fascinated by. Just real quick, when did you start going to Speaker's Corner and doing all the debates with various worldviews? When did that begin?
In the way that everybody recognises me, about 6 years ago. I went down to support Dr. J. Smith, who inspired me and has been an inspiration to me for pretty much my whole Christian evangelism to Muslims. And I went down about 6 years ago to support him. And on the first day that I went to his seminar to say, I've come down to support you, he said, great, I'm leaving next week. And then I went with him to the corner, and then the following week, he was the first week that he was gone, that he'd gone back to America, and was my first week at the corner. So it was literally Dr. J. Smith left the corner, and the following Sunday I started at the corner in my own right, and I just kind of picked up the baton and carried on from that point. And immediately even people in the corner, non-Baha'is, atheists, even other Muslims, they all recognised it as like, you're just another J. Smith. And even other people, Baha'is, recognised it. It's like God coordinated it, Dr. J. Smith left, and then I started, and it's been a continuous effort at the corner, organised by the Lord.
So good, amen. This might be a massive question, and it might require a whole podcast to answer, maybe at a separate time. But as best you can, in terms of in the time frame that we do have, I know there is obviously a huge battle of worldviews in the UK when it comes to Islam and Christianity. And there's been obviously an explosion of growth within Islam, especially in certain areas within the UK as well. How do you feel the culture war, so to speak? How do you feel? Do you feel the tide is turning when it comes to Christianity within the UK? Do you feel people are becoming more proactive in their belief structures, are more interested in Christianity? What do you feel? Where do you feel that the culture tide is at the moment?
I think that with better leadership, the church would be in with a fighting chance, because there is a new interest in Christianity that has emerged. But I'll just tell you a little anecdote to just tell you how bad Christian leadership is at the moment. I went to a church, and in the middle of the church service, during the intercessionary prayers, one of the prayers was, and we will pray, and Lord, we pray against the rise of the far right. But now the reason why that's problematic is it's not in the UK, at least. I know it's different in the southern states of America. But in the UK, at least, the far right is not attacking churches, but the far left does, and Islamists do. And yet, the church that I went to thought that the thing that it needed to pray against was the rise of the far right, which are the group that is most open to the Christian faith. So there is a real opportunity in the UK if the church pivots its evangelism to the right and cultivates that political energy for a Christian political vision of society, for the church to really go on the front foot. Unfortunately, I fear that a lot of our church leaders are just going to fumble and drop the ball, but there is a new interest in the Christian faith. And the UK, as Tom Holland said recently in his podcast on trigonometry, the UK is in a bit of a choke point, and we have a number of different possible horizons for us. It's no longer the continuity of the fall of the Iron Wall, the end of communism, the end of history. It's no longer that straight line of, well, we know where we're going and we know what we're doing. We've now got different horizons that are very evident to us. One is a civil war. One is the collapse of any resistance and complete Islamization. One is the possible resurgence of Christianity, which is the most distant of those options. Another one is the possibility of some kind of re-emergence of Thatcherite politics and a harder conservatism in the Reform Party that really doesn't do much, But we've got real problems here in the UK now, really significant problems, and it's stagnation caused through a lack of vision, a cowardice, and the progressive brain rot that is progressive ideology.
Bob, if you ever run and I was eligible to vote, I'd vote for you. Okay, you got my vote.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I would like to thank you very much for coming on and sharing the information that you've done today. I think you've really blessed me and whoever listens to this podcast. It's going to be really informative and equipping. I think it's going to be very exhortative as well, in terms of once people are equipped with some of this knowledge, they'll be better able to articulate the Islamic worldview and hopefully evangelize in a more efficient fashion towards Muslims. So would I just like to leave the opportunity now to, if people wanted to find you in terms of, I'm not sure if you have Instagram or TikTok, but I know you've got YouTube. What is the best place to find you? And also, what is the best place, and if the audience wants to support your ministry and the things that you're doing, well, how's the best way to go about that?
So the best way to do this is to go to my YouTube channel, which is not SOCO Films, and it is not Revelations 22, and it's not Revival at Speaker's Corner, and it's not any other channel other than the channel that is Bob of Speaker's Corner. That's my YouTube channel, and you'll know it's mine because it's the one with the red background and the black crown of thorns. That's the emblem for the channel. That is my only YouTube channel, and on there you've got my email address, you've got links to my blog, you've got links to my Patreon, and on my blog you can donate, and on my Patreon you can get involved, and then I have like Bible studies and apologetics classes on my Patreon. On my blog you've got lots of articles that I write on all different kinds of issues, and then obviously you've got the channel itself where I do live streams and where this video itself is going to appear. So that's another way to test that you found the right channel, is because the only channel that's mine that will have this video is this one, and yours.
Awesome. And we're going to leave it in the link in the description below, guys, as well as Bob's Twitter link as well, which I can see you're pretty active on there, which is just great to see what you're commenting on. So first and foremost, thank you so much for coming on. I'd love to do another episode with you. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you took the time. And
I've only scratched the surface, bro. I've got loads to talk about. Only scratched the surface.
We're definitely gonna have to do a part 2, and we'll definitely make time for that if you're willing. That'd be great.
Definitely, yeah. And maybe we can, because you do theology, we can do some of the Bobisms that often get me into trouble.
Okay, yeah, all right.
All those controversial stances that I take, and we could maybe have an intelligent conversation around them.
That would be amazing. That would be so good. Okay, Thank you very much.
Anyway, Bob. Peace be with you. God bless, brother. Take care.
God bless. God bless.